And very pleased to be joined by the former Minister of Finance for Canada, the Honourable Joe Oliver. Joe, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Great to be here.
So one of the big themes, and you're talking about this at the Manning Conference this year, the idea of really this fiscal situation we find ourselves in Canada. Mm-hmm. We had a budget that is probably not surprising in an election year, just giving out money to everyone imaginable from the Liberals. But one question that I think has come up a lot in political discussions are the minute details that matter to you as a former finance minister, that matter to policy wonks. Are these things that actually resonate with Canadians, that fiscal health of the country when it comes to elections?
Well, this is, of course, one of the challenges. People do focus when we're in a crisis. The problem is, of course, we don't want to be in a crisis, and you have to prevent a crisis by being prudent over the longer term. And unfortunately, that's not what's happening. As you recall, I was, if you're old enough to remember and nostalgic enough to care, I was the first one to present a balanced budget in some period of time. Mm-hmm. And the Liberal government coming in made sure that year's budget turned into a deficit budget. The first 11 months were all in surplus, and it totaled about $7.5 billion. And so they, in the last month, they put in well over $9 billion to substantiate their pretense that they were left with a deficit. As you recall, the Liberals said in their platform they would start with a modest $10 billion budget. It would never go above that, and then by 2019, they'd be in surplus. Of course, right now, there have been a series of large, much larger deficits, and there is no balanced budget in sight. The consequences of that can be particularly dire if we encounter a downturn, which of course is inevitable, and most economists think will happen in the next year or two. When that occurs, automatic stabilizers go into operation, which means costs go up. Revenue is already down because it's a downturn, and then there's a political tendency to stimulate even more, so that a $20 billion deficit, which is what the current budget envisages, could easily double or even triple. So that's when you get into severe problems, and at that point the public will become aware of the issue. In the meantime, the challenge is to tell them what the problems are ongoing, and one of the consequences of deficit financing is that your interest payments continue to increase, and right now,
and not insignificantly either.
No, not at all. Exactly. If you combine federal, provincial, and municipal debt, the total interest payment per capita annually is over $1,700. That means the average person is paying over $1,700 a year. Wow. Just for interest. They're getting nothing for it, but of course it's an obligation. So you start $1,700 behind, and of course those who are in the middle class or upper middle class are paying in effect more, multiples of that. So there were real consequences. In addition to that, when you have more government spending, you crowd out the private sector, and you inhibit growth, because to the extent you have to pay tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars in debt, then of course that eats away at growth, which at the end of the day reduces revenue to the government. So there's a sort of a vicious cycle that comes into play. The challenge is to communicate that in a convincing way to the public, which is difficult to do, because in a lot of cases they think this is a kind of an arcane sort of subject. So you somehow have to get it down to a level where they can see how it impacts them. and it's a continuing challenge.
Yes, and I think that when you talk about the forecasting here, obviously just last week we had a very negative day for markets. You had a forecasted recession that was impacting and putting a lot of pessimism there. And I know that when it comes to stimulating the economy, which is sometimes controversial because spending and investing look differently to some people and look the same to others, but does the money that Justin Trudeau is pumping into Canada, in his view, through this budget, does that help the economy in any way? I mean, with what you're seeing in this budget, does this actually stimulate anything?
Well, you see, this is the issue. They started by saying, we're in a period of slower growth. We've got to stimulate the economy to raise that. Well, you can't indefinitely spend more than you earn and expect that to continually raise up the growth rate, because the more you do it, the more interest you pay, and the more it has the opposite effect. So they started by saying that. They also said, well, it's a period of low interest rates. We need critical infrastructure. Let's spend it on infrastructure because that has a long-term value. The problem is they haven't really been spending it on this kind of infrastructure that would have a long-term value, and a lot of it has gone to social spending, however they've chosen to name it. And that creates a problem because it's really a current expenditure which becomes entrenched. So then you have a structural deficit built into to your fiscal framework, and it's extraordinarily difficult to escape from that. So you get yourself into a trap. The so-called multiplier effect that they claim they would get out of government spending, that if they put in $1, it'll generate more, is economically unsound. And the Bank of Canada has said that a smaller economy with a floating currency and open trade doesn't really benefit from the multiplier effect that the Liberal government claims to be in place. So, I mean, part of it is where they've chosen to spend the money, and part of it is, of course, the total amount that they've chosen to spend. And in both cases, they've created longer-term problems. And then, of course, there's the moral issue, which is that no family would want to saddle their children with debt for expenses they've incurred for their own enjoyment, and no country should either.
Yeah, and that actually ties into, I think, the very valid point you made at the beginning of this, which is that people need to understand that relationship between how the government's managing its finances and how a household manages theirs. And no household could be afloat if they ran things the way the government is. And I guess that's where I get very pessimistic on this, because we went from Justin Trudeau saying there's going to be that little tiny deficit that I know the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper made fun of, I think, very effectively. And then this has become, okay, in 4 years. And now it's not even like they're kicking the can to a particular point. It's that this honestly is not a priority. And one thing we've seen from, I think, Justin Trudeau and Bill Morneau is this idea that when the economy's going well, we can afford to spend, and when the economy's not going well, we need to spend. Right. And I'm waiting for the scenario. I'm waiting for the scenario where no spending's required.
When you don't, and if it's just moving along, that's the Keynesian. I mean, Keynes would be rolling in his grave because he felt that expenditures should be undertaken when there's a downturn, not when you're in a period of growth. And let's face it, it's not only conservatives that have sometimes missed the message. In Alberta, when oil was at $100 a barrel, they were spending more than they were earning, and now they're paying dearly for that. There are a whole host of other issues, but
on that question though of Alberta, I mean, do you think we as a country have to move beyond being resource dependent, or do you think we already have from an economic perspective?
Well, from an economic perspective, the bulk, I mean, the oil and gas industry is very important, but it isn't the bulk of our GDP. I mean, oil and gas represents 10% of the GDP. So we're pretty diversified. The tragedy, of course, is that we're landlocked and we have no access to overseas market. We're paying an immense discount to the international price when we export our oil and gas to the United States. It's averaged about $15 billion a year. It reached a high of about $40 billion on an annualized basis. And there's, I don't know, 150,000 people in Alberta who were formerly employed in the oil and gas industry who are unemployed. So this is a very serious issue. There's national security implications and so on. And it's all because we haven't been able to build a pipeline that would transport our oil and gas to Tidewater in the east and the west. And that's one of the structural impediments to more robust growth. So, no one is saying that we shouldn't be focusing on technology and manufacturing and so on. But here we've got these resources. We've been enormously blessed with the third largest proven oil reserves in the entire world, and we are the fourth biggest producer of natural gas in the world. We've got 171 billion barrels of proven oil, and I think it's 415 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and yet our industry is on its back. Well, why is that? We know why. It's because government policy, government regulation, and opposition to the development of our resources has put an industry on its back, an industry that should be flourishing for the benefit not only of Alberta, but the entire country. And it's forgotten how much Alberta contributes. Like it's $20 billion more
Yes.
than they receive, and Quebec is
The inverse of that.
The inverse of that. And that's really unfortunate. You're killing the goose that laid the golden egg, and it's hurting people, and it's hurting people first in Alberta, but right across the country. And who's it hurting the most? It's hurting blue-collar workers and the economically disadvantaged, and that's why I think it's profoundly immoral.
One last question then, Joe, and that is on trade. I know that it was a point of pride for the government in which you were a part, all of the trade deals that were inked, and even
over 50.
And even ones that weren't as high profile, that were very significant. And when you look at ultimately the biggest trade deal of Justin Trudeau's premiership, which is the replacement to NAFTA, the USMCA, or we're supposed to call it the CMUSA, or whatever it is, this deal, is it one that you think will deal with the issues that were in NAFTA?
Well, first of all, it hasn't been signed yet in the States, and it may not be for some time. It's not a high priority for Congress. The Democrats put it in the back drawer. They don't want to give a victory to President Trump, but they got other things that they care about more, and so that's a real concern. In the meantime, of course, there's still tariffs on steel and aluminum. I think, it wasn't a great deal, but it was better than no deal, and hopefully we won't have no deal. There are a few problematic aspects to it, and one is that we're going to need permission from the United States to enter into a deal with a non-market economy. Now, I'm certainly not one to argue that we need to have or should have a free trade deal with China. I think we should do it on a sectoral basis. And of course, the best thing we could possibly do is get the pipelines built and start transporting our oil to China. Yes. There's no compromise needed in that regard.
Just get it to market.
Just get it to market, because there is a strategic complementarity between Canada and China on this issue. We want to diversify our markets. They want to diversify their sources of supply. So it's you know, and I was there, and I spoke actually directly to the president of China, Xi Jinping, and that was his view as well. I mean, it's obviously the case. So but after a while, you know, they're not interested anymore because we simply can't deliver. I think the trade deal is all right, but we should focus right now as much as we can on trade diversification. We don't want to be quite as dependent. I mean, this is a very old story, but you know, since Justin Trudeau's father talked about a third way, and you know, what happened? Well, there's been more and more focus on the U.S. market. And now I think 76% of our trade goes to the United States, and it's highly asymmetrical, as we know.
Former Federal Finance Minister Joe Oliver. Joe, thank you very much for your time.
Great to chat.